Hi, welcome to part 2 of the home team training. My name is Yvonne Yentsch. I'm a social worker with the Department of Aging in the Senior Center Division. And later in this training, we're going to be joined by Kyla Duhart, a social worker in the Senior Center Division as well. What we're going to talk about are best practices and self-care tips for you as a volunteer. And we're going to talk a little bit about the importance of social connections, emotional well-being, so you have a basis of understanding some of the tools that we're going to provide later on in the training. So right now we're going to get started with our first slide and hope you get some good information from this training. Why are social connections important? So studies have shown that there are a lot of benefits to social connections. And as volunteers with Home Team, one of the benefits of your interaction with the clients is the social connection with them. And it's very important. And these connections become more critical as we age and experience life changes. Because as people age, there's a lot of changes with their physical well-being, emotional, or also cognitive changes. Also, there's a loss of independence. It could be from driving, mobility issues, being able to get around, that can reduce those connections. And also changes in support systems. People retire and they don't have that day-to-day interaction. Family moves away, the loss of friends. So those are all some things that can happen as people age. But what are the benefits of social connections? So one of the most important benefits is that it does reduce isolation. It also adds meaning to our lives. You know, what will we do without our friends, our family, for the support, the fun, the laughter that we have with them? It also improves our mood. Studies have found that people that are connected are more positive, happy, and that can also help our physical and emotional well-being. It also can reduce stress. It also has been found to aid our immune system. So it's really important for people to keep those connections. And as a volunteer with the Home Team program, that is something that you're going to give to those clients, is that connection. So we're going to move on to the next slide, which talks about the risks of social isolation. Okay. So studies have found that the heightened health risks from social isolation can be as much as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. So when we think about smoking and the impact that has had on people's health, the social isolation has a significant impact. Also, it can impact on our cognition, physical and mental health. People can go into depressions, their cognitive status can decline, poor sleep, just overall poor habits. Also, people that are socially isolated can be at risk for mistreatment and also for self-neglect, not taking care of themselves, not taking their medications, taking care of their nutrition, those types of things. Also, people can be vulnerable to scams and frauds. When we're feeling lonely, isolated, it can open us up to that emotional manipulation from the scammers. And also, when we don't have connections, we don't have those individuals to talk to maybe run that by. Oh, I got a call from this person today. They want me to send them money, and you don't have that buffer to say, hey, no, I'm not going to do that, or you shouldn't do that. So now we're going to talk about the aging process and emotional well-being. So there are a lot of different factors as we age that can impact our emotional well-being. One of the things that is important to note is that depression and anxiety can be very common in older adults, one of the most common mental health problems for older adults as they age. And many people can experience their first episode of depression after the age of 65. It is not a normal part of aging. Also, anxiety, people can see a new onset of anxiety. And what are some of the factors that impact emotional well-being? So first and foremost are medical illnesses, heart disease, cancer, arthritis, diabetes. There's a strong correlation between depression and some of these medical illnesses. Also, chronic pain can impact on an individual's well-being. Loss of senses, hearing and vision, they can also be very isolating and keep people from those social connections that are very important, which ultimately impacts their emotional well-being. Sleep disturbances, people experiencing depression, anxiety can have sleep disturbances. People with many other issues can have sleep disturbances. Medication side effects, also alcohol and prescription misuse. This is something that we do see with older adults that sometimes can fly under the radar, but can have an impact on their emotional well-being. Also, a number of people may have already or through their lives experienced chronic mental health issues, histories of depression, also trauma in their life, grief, which sometimes can come back based on different episodes or issues that they may have as an older adult. And then poor social connections, which we talked a little bit about, which keeps people isolated and feeling lonely. All of these have an impact on how we're feeling emotionally. So as a volunteer, one of the important things is to develop healthy relationships with our clients. And this can promote emotional well-being. So one of the most important things that we need to do when we're working with our clients is our communication and really making sure that we're attending to what they're saying and also showing them respect and empathy. So we've talked a little bit, we have here a little bit of some of the keys and what are some of the most important things when we're talking about communication. So active listening, which we'll talk a little bit about later, is really attending to the person, paying attention to their feelings, and listening. Empathy is our capacity to understand or feel what another person is experiencing from within their frame of reference. We can demonstrate compassion, and it enables us to establish rapport with them. Nonverbal, I think you've probably all heard how important nonverbal communication is, and this can be our facial expressions, our body posture, our gestures, eye contact. You know, when we're talking with someone, they need to see that we're connecting with them. Sometimes it can even be our tone of voice. Also, we want to make sure we're respecting that individual. That means we're communicating clearly with them. We're working to prevent misunderstandings. We're acknowledging their concerns. And also setting limits and keeping healthy boundaries, which we're going to explain a little bit more about in the future. But first, we want to really talk a little bit more about what is active listening. So as I mentioned, active listening is being attentive to what the person is saying. It's also more listening than talking. And this is where sometimes those nonverbal cues can come in. We need to also make sure that we're trying to understand from the client's perspective. We may or may not agree with what they're saying, or we may feel very strongly or very sad or emotional for that client, but we need to be able to keep our emotions in line so that we can provide that support to them. So what are some of the techniques for active listening? So paraphrasing, which is really just restating the information that they've given you. And it's maybe using different words, but it's basically testing your understanding of what they're trying to communicate. Some of the things you could say are, what I'm hearing is, sounds like what you're saying. I'm not sure I'm with you, but just kind of say what you think they said. Clarifying is when you want them to explain a little bit more about an aspect of what they may be talking about. And this gives an opportunity for them to elaborate and clarify. So this could be, do you mean Can you say more about? That type of thing. Reflecting is really showing that you are understanding and acknowledging their feelings and how they're feeling about this situation. And this could be, it sounds like you're frustrated. It seems like you felt confused and worried about what may happen. And finally, summarizing is really when you're taking all of that information they've given you and really trying to put it out there and understanding what they're trying to say. What is it that's most important to them? You may feel in listening to them, they should focus on something else, or their current concerns should be a different direction, but we need to look at what the client is saying and what their perspective is. And it's as easy as saying, what I am hearing you say, or let me summarize what I've heard so far. So it's also important when we talk about active listening that we don't dominate the conversation. Try not to interrupt and also jump to conclusions or argue. And this is where sometimes, like I said, we may not agree with what they're saying, but it's important that's what they're feeling, that's what they're communicating. So along with active listening, another important thing as we work with clients are setting limits. And how do we do that? So the most important thing is first connect with an individual is you want to communicate your role. You both have to have an understanding of the expectations of what you as a volunteer are able to do, how often you're going to be seeing them and what your interaction is going to be. We want to think about when we interact before we rescue. Whose needs are we meeting? We're working with clients who have a lot of difficulties or challenges. And sometimes we want to help as much as we can. But we have to make sure that we're meeting the client's needs, not our own needs to be that rescuer. We want to be careful about how much information you share because, this is a volunteer role. And although you're going to make probably a very strong connection with the individuals, they're going to share a lot. They may ask you a lot of questions. We all have different comfort levels. And we want to make sure that there is some boundary of volunteer and client. And it's real important that we not overshare or put our burdens on that individual and also respect our own privacy, which is okay. The other important thing is it's okay to say no and set limits. Whether it's, they want you to call 3 or 4 times. Well, you can only call once a week or twice a week. Maybe they want to ask you, well, can you run to the store? I'll give you my card, go get me some food or whatever. If that's not within the policies and procedures and boundaries of what you are to do as a volunteer, you don't want to do that. It's also, if at any point you feel uncomfortable with what a client's asking you to do, please consult with the home team staff and let them know. And do this the first time you're feeling uncomfortable. Also observe the client's behavior and communication. And, make sure, you can pick up if there's changes or things like that. And safeguard confidentiality. That's so important in working with clients. You may hear a lot about their situations, but it's so important that you respect their confidentiality. So I've talked a little when we talk about boundary, setting limits, it also relates to boundaries. So what are boundaries? So the next slide defines a little bit about boundaries. So boundaries are kind of, if you look at it as a dividing line, and in a relationship, it limits the limits that allow for a safe connection between you and the client. And they're always based on the client's needs, not our wants or their wants, okay? And these boundaries are set by policies that the home team may have. Baltimore County Department of Aging policies and procedures. There may be county policies and procedures, ethical standards that as volunteers you need to meet. So all of those things can impact and define the boundaries of your role with that individual. But boundaries are healthy, and it's important to maintain boundaries because it protects the clients as well as you as a volunteer. Because if you're working within your boundaries and something could happen, you're protected because you've followed those policies and procedures. And also, modeling healthy boundaries and setting those limits can be actually helpful to clients who may not really have a lot of boundaries. So what are some things we can do to establish and keep our boundaries with clients? And this really kind of goes back to a lot of the setting limits, is we really want to start when we first meet the client. It's important that the clients understand the guidelines of the service, what to expect from you, the confidentiality, and when you may need to disclose information. A lot of times people will say, well, I want to tell you something, but please don't tell anybody else. Well, we can't promise that, particularly if it's something that could be harmful to others or to themselves. And it's important that people at the beginning of that relationship understand that. Also, communicate clearly. If you feel at any point there's misunderstanding, go back and review that. And that could happen along the process, where maybe you've worked with someone for a long time and they're starting to push, boundaries or limits. Go back to what you first talked about. There's never a time when you can't return to those expectations and limits. And address situations as they occur. You don't want them to continue, because if you blur those boundaries one time, that person could expect that to continue. And that can cause problems. And then you may get into a situation where you're feeling very uncomfortable and it's kind of snowballed. And we really don't want that to happen. So you want to address things as they happen. So boundary issues around time and place. So this may be, what time you're going to call someone who may be wanting to call excessively. We need to set some boundaries with them. Maybe they're not respecting the time. Maybe you're there and to be talking with them or visiting with them for an hour. They want you to stay longer or want to come multiple times. Those are all types of boundaries. Understanding confidentiality and disclosure. So as I talked about, it's important that they understand that you cannot keep information, or you have to seek support from the home team staff if someone talks about harming themselves or others, or if you have a concern about that client. Verbal oversharing, we talked a little bit about that, sharing information. Physical contact. I know in this time of COVID, we may be doing phone calls or not having as much contact, but as we move to hopefully getting back into doing friendly visiting, this can become an issue. We all have different boundaries, space boundaries, and also what comfort we are. Some people like to hug. Even with COVID, some people may want to do that, but some people are comfortable shaking hands. So we need to respect that. You may be someone who likes to be closer, be close with space, but that client may not. So we need to be respectful. Also gifts. Older adults, when someone's helping them, they want to give back. And that's something that you want to make sure you understand with home team about what the boundaries are. Because as county employees, we're not able to accept gifts from clients. So that's something as a volunteer, you may want to check with home team. Also, invitations to personal events. This is another area that sometimes people can ask, well, come to my birthday party or that. And we have to be careful about those. And a request to go beyond the scope of your volunteer role or break the rules. This could be, well, I'm going to give you my card. Can you go get me some cigarettes? Or can you go to the store and do this or that for me? And it's really important that we not start that and be respectful and explain what the boundaries are. Because what can happen is that if we break those boundaries, one, it can snowball, but also it can have an impact on a future volunteer who may work with that person, or even the home team staff when they have to come in and explain that's not within the realm of their service. So one of the things when we talk about boundaries is we can get into a situation where we feel like we're rescuing. And, how do we identify that maybe we've gone too far with a client? And how do we know when we're beyond? So one of the first things is we spend too much time with that rescued person. And this can be to the detriment of your own self-care. You may find yourself so emotionally wrapped up with that person that you're working with that you're not even taking care of your own situation, or you're thinking more about what's happening with them than taking care of yourself. You can create a situation where the senior continues to make more and more demands. You've done it one time. Well, you did this. Well, why won't you do this? So that can really be a problem. Also, it can sometimes discourage them from maybe helping themselves or developing other support networks. There may have been things that people have suggested to them, but because you're filling all of that need, you're keeping them maybe from reaching out to other supports. Also, you inflate the client's expectations. And the other thing is sometimes we end up protecting that person, but it's not to their benefit because, maybe you're noticing that they're struggling and they're not able to be as independent. So what can happen is by protecting that, they're really not getting the service and the support that they need. And we all want people to be in the least restrictive environment. And we don't want to see someone not be able to be independent, but we also have to understand that we want them to be safe, okay? So if any of those things sound familiar to you at any point when you're working with individuals, you may be a rescuer. So what do you do if you find yourself in that situation? The first thing you want to do is talk to the home team staff and let them know and seek support for them. If something feels uncomfortable for you, and if you kind of were that fly on the wall and looking at that situation and taking a step back and thinking, that's really, should we be doing that? You want to seek that support. So it's, your role is very important, and sometimes it can be really hard when we're working with those individuals who have a lot of needs not to want to do more for them. But we do have to remember those limits, boundaries. So I've talked a little bit about our communication, the importance of our connections. So Kyla is now going to talk a little bit about working one-on-one with specific challenges with clients, some things that you may see, certain behaviors or individual challenges. So here's Kyla Duhart, our social worker with the Department of Aging and Senior Centers, and thank you for your time.
Hello, everyone. Thanks, Yvonne. That was great. So I want to go ahead and get right into talking about some types of clients that you all may interact with, volunteer for the home team. One of those clients may be a difficult or not so friendly client. So some clients are not going to be as open at first. They may be anxious or nervous, talking to someone that they're not familiar with, and it can take time to build trust. And that's okay. So you'll want to start where the client is. Try not to force the conversation and allow for silence. Silence is okay. That just means the client may be taking the time to process the information that was said either by you as the volunteer or information that they have just shared with you. You also may encounter a complainer, someone who just is focused on negative things that are going on in their life. And you'll want to listen, restate the problem as you hear it, and stay calm. But please do not give in to this type of client as far as agreeing with anything that they say that they may feel that they would want to complain about. So for instance, if they're complaining about how they hate the Redskins football team and they hate what's happening in the news and they hate what their wife fed them for dinner, we don't want to go ahead and agree, yep, you know what, I hate that team too, and I don't like that food either. What we want to do instead is try to refocus their attention on something more positive. So if you find that they're saying something that you can twist and turn into a positive, then that's what you'll want to do. An angry or aggressive client is another type of client that you may interact with while being a volunteer for Home Team. You'll want to speak calmly and do not respond with anger. So if they're yelling and they're expressing frustration, the last thing you'll want to do is go to that level with them. That'll just escalate the situation even more. And the goal when dealing with an angry or aggressive client is to try to de-escalate the situation as much as possible. So don't try to solve their problem right there in the moment. That can be done at another time. But if you're finding, even after staying calm, listening, and being patient with this client that is expressing frustration and anger, and they're still escalating, then at that point, you'll want to let the client know, you know what, I understand that you're feeling frustrated at this time, but I'm not going to be able to continue the conversation when you're feeling this upset and this angry. So I will call you back at another time. It's okay to not tolerate when an individual is becoming aggressive, because although you were there to help people, you still are there to receive respect at the end of the day and to feel safe. And if that's not happening, then you'll want to exit that conversation and pick it up at another time when you're feeling safer. And of course, please contact the Home Team staff if you do encounter a client that is feeling aggressive at any time. You also may interact with a client that over time starts to shift in their mood. Maybe at one point they seemed more elevated and they seemed more engaged. And you may find that, over time, not so much. They're feeling a bit depressed. They're not seeming interested in things that they once were interested in. And they're losing weight or they're sleeping more. So these may be symptoms of depression. And they are definitely things that we want to be mindful of. And we want to make sure that once again, we're contacting the Home Team staff if you're finding that you're seeing a client start to decline in this manner. Next slide, please. So I also want to get into some risk factors and signs of suicide. So when we talk about the topic of suicide, I know that that can feel very intimidating, very overwhelming, and very heavy. So I want to make sure that we talk about some of the risk factors and warning signs so that we're able to support this type of client. The definition of risk factors are characteristics that make it more likely that someone will consider, attempt, or die by suicide. They can't cause or predict a suicide attempt, but they're important to be aware of. So knowing the warning signs. So I just want to preface with the fact that any one of these warning signs that I'm about to discuss are not necessarily signs of suicide. But if you're finding, let's say you're dealing with a client and there's a few of these signs that are popping up, then you want to be mindful. And of course, contact the Home Team staff if you have any sort of concern, if you're dealing with a client who you feel like may be suicidal. One of the signs that you may encounter is talking about wanting to die or wanting to kill themselves. So if you have someone saying, I just don't want to live anymore, I just wish I didn't wake up the next morning, quotes like that are things that are red flags, and you would like to try to support that person in getting them help as soon as possible. If the client is looking for a way to kill themselves, like searching online or buying a gun, or even suggesting that they are going to take a large amount of their medication all at one time, definitely a sign that they may be a plan that is active and that they're wanting to harm themselves. They may talk about feeling hopeless or having no reason to live, talking about feeling trapped or in unbearable pain, So for instance, pain can be very, very difficult for an individual to deal with. And pain sometimes, if chronic, can go outside of just the physical aspect. Chronic pain can definitely lead to emotional distress. So if you have an individual who on the onset is discussing that they struggle with pain, definitely be mindful of how they're feeling and what their moods are from a day-to-day basis. If they talk about being a burden to others, or they have an increase in their use of alcohol or drugs, if they're feeling anxious or agitated or behaving recklessly, or if they're sleeping too little or too much. You also may find that a client may start to withdraw or isolate themselves. Now, during the pandemic, we're all been put in a position of where we're having to isolate ourselves. So this may be a little bit trickier to notice at this time, but I'll share an example of someone who may, or what it may look like when someone isolates themselves. Pandemic, we're not present as it is now. So if you have a client who you're talking to who ordinarily would be participating in the senior center, and all of a sudden they seem to be pulling back and staying home and not going out as much as they used to, then that is something to keep an eye on. You also can watch out for an individual that is withdrawn, even during the pandemic that's going on right now. So for instance, if you have a client that at one point was staying in touch with their sibling or their daughter, and now they're no longer interacting with this person or keeping in contact with this person, or maybe they're no longer taking that walk with that neighbor, and you're starting to notice that they're withdrawing, be mindful of that. And finally, you also may see warning signs such as someone showing rage or talking about seeking revenge and extreme mood swings. So if you do find that you're in a situation, you have a client, they're struggling to get out of bed, they are only eating once a day, and they're saying that they are thinking about taking their gun and just ending their life. So you have this client who's making these sort of statements. What do you do next? So you'll want to let the client know what it is that you're concerned about. So I'm concerned that you are feeling down and not getting out of bed and not eating, and that you're saying that you have this plan to harm yourself. And then at that point, you'll want to let them know that you're going to contact the home team supervisor so that you can provide them with that extra support. So you may have a client who at that point says, oh, no, I wasn't serious. I was just saying that, I'm going to be fine. But you just want to reiterate the importance of their safety and making sure they get the support that they need. So even if there's some pushback, please just let them know you are going to, in fact, contact the home team supervisor for support. So you may be wondering, okay, well, what happens if I'm talking to this client and it's Saturday afternoon? Well, do not stress. If it's outside of work hours, there is a Baltimore County crisis response hotline that works 24/7. So you will not be alone. And please, if you're finding that you're dealing with a client who is suicidal, reach out to the Baltimore County crisis response and let them know what's going on. And just to give you an idea of what will happen once the Baltimore County crisis response is called, they'll take the information that you've given them, reach out to the client, and who the person is that will be reaching out to the client is a mental health provider, and they will be able to assess for suicide at that time and provide any additional support if needed. So they may need a wellness check at that point, depending on what information the mental health provider gathers at that point. And also, of course, if you have called Baltimore County Crisis Response, the next business day, please make sure to contact the home team supervisor. So now that we've talked about dealing with difficult clients, angry clients, and even possibly clients that are expressing signs of suicide, we want to make sure that we are taking care of ourselves. So self-care tips for you all would include sleeping, making sure you're getting enough sleep, making sure you're exercising, like chair exercises, yoga, taking a walk, eating right, make sure you're getting those fruits and veggies in and your proteins, hydration, also very important, and saying no to others. Earlier in this PowerPoint, we discussed boundaries. And boundaries are not only important in working as a volunteer, but also in our personal life. So please, if you have to say no to other people and I need a break right now, I need some time to myself, then do that. It'll be beneficial for you in the long run. Take time to enjoy a favorite hobby, whether that's gardening, cooking, reading, coloring, whatever it may be, something that can just put your mind at ease, take your mind off of what may be stressing you, do that. Mindfulness and meditation are also great ways to de-stress. So some deep breathing techniques are excellent ways to relax and lessen some of the feelings that you may be having. And so definitely those are two things that I would recommend. And also as a part of mindfulness, I would suggest practicing gratitude. So focus on what is positive and what is going well in your life can really make a huge difference. And finally, schedule your self-care time. If you have to, make sure that you're getting in 30 minutes a day or an hour every other day of self-care time, do it. Because the thing is, if you're not able to refuel and recharge or pour into yourself and take care of yourself, then it's going to be difficult for you to take care of other people. So please make sure that you focus on your self-care, take care of yourself. As we conclude, we would like to thank you for listening to our presentation on best practices in self-care. We hope that you have found this information helpful and will be able to apply it with your clients. Your role as a home team volunteer is very important, and we thank you in advance for volunteering your time to support your older adults of Baltimore County.